The locks on my front door had been changed, and the heavy oak key that had opened this home for the past decade felt like a worthless piece of scrap metal in my trembling hand. I stared at the "For Sale" sign, planted firmly in my manicured lawn, its glaring white surface reflecting the cruel midday sun, and realized that my own home had become a stage set for a betrayal I never saw coming. My mother-in-law, Elena, hadn't just changed the locks. She had managed to convince a local real estate agent that I was a fugitive who had abandoned the property, all while she held a glass of Chardonnay on my porch, mocking the neighborhood with a smile that could freeze water. She thought she was clever, believing that my absence during a short-term business trip would be the perfect window to strip me of everything I had worked for. But she forgot one crucial detail. The original deed, stamped and notarized, was sitting safely in my purse, and I was exactly 2 minutes away from introducing her to a very different kind of reality. 2 weeks earlier, my life had been a picture of quiet, enviable domesticity. I remember the smell of fresh lavender laundry detergent clinging to the curtains, and the way the morning light would dance across the marble island in my kitchen. A kitchen I had renovated with the bonus from my first major promotion. My husband, Mark, would usually be at the breakfast table, nursing a black coffee and complaining about the commute, his eyes crinkling at the corners whenever he looked at me. It was a comfortable, predictable rhythm. We were a team, or so I had convinced myself, despite the subtle, lingering tension that had begun to creep into our evenings. Elena had been a constant, if slightly abrasive, presence in our lives since the wedding. She was the type of woman who rearranged your spice rack while you were in the shower and offered unsolicited critiques on your choice of window treatments. For years, I had tolerated her constant hovering as a quirk of her possessive nature. I excused her snide comments about my career as a byproduct of her old-fashioned upbringing. I looked at her as a harmless nuisance, a woman who simply had too much time on her hands and too little of a life of her own. "You really should consider putting the house in a trust, dear," she had said just last month, swirling her drink in my living room, her eyes darting toward the mahogany desk where I kept my files. "It's just too much responsibility for someone like you. Mark is so busy, and with your job, well, things slip through the cracks." At the time, I had laughed it off, pouring her another glass of wine and mentally noting that I needed to move my files to the office. I didn't see the hunger in her gaze, or the way she looked at my home, not as a place of comfort, but as an asset waiting to be liquidated. I was too busy being the perfect wife, the perfect employee, and the perfect daughter-in-law to see that the cracks she spoke of were actually the foundation of a trap she was meticulously laying for me. Mark, for his part, had seemed increasingly distracted. He had started taking calls in the garage, the muffled sound of his voice cutting through the silence of our nights. Whenever I asked him what was wrong, he would simply kiss my forehead and tell me he was stressed about an upcoming merger. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to cling to the version of our life that felt stable, safe, and entirely mine. I didn't know then that the very foundation of my existence was being sold out from under me, and that the person I shared my bed with was either too weak to stop it or too complicit to care. I stood there on the driveway, the asphalt burning through the soles of my shoes, and felt the weight of the house looming behind me. The house that had been my sanctuary was now a crime scene. I touched the leather of my handbag, confirming the presence of the thick manila envelope tucked inside. My heart was pounding, a rhythmic thud against my ribs that echoed the sound of the wind in the trees, but my mind was sharpening, turning cold and precise. Elena liked to play games of ownership, and she liked to believe that she was the architect of my misery. She had no idea that I had spent the last 3 years keeping receipts for every single decision she'd ever tried to make for me. The silence of the neighborhood, usually so peaceful, now felt like a held breath, waiting for the scream that was about to shatter everything. The transition from annoyance to alarm didn't happen with a bang, but with a series of tiny, paper-thin cracks. It started with my mail. I noticed that my bank statements, which had always been delivered to the house, were suddenly arriving opened or not at all. When I confronted Mark, he blamed the neighborhood postal carrier, his voice tight and unnaturally loud, as if he were practicing for a performance. "You're being paranoid, Sarah," he said, not meeting my eyes, his focus entirely on the tie he was adjusting in the hallway mirror. Maybe the post office is just understaffed again. Don't let your stress turn into delusions. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But the feeling of being watched intensified. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found Elena sitting at my desk, her fingers hovering over my laptop keyboard. She slammed it shut so hard the entire house seemed to vibrate. She didn't apologize. She just smiled, that thin, bloodless smile, and told me she was looking for a recipe for the dinner party I hadn't even planned. The look of cold calculation in her eyes wasn't that of a meddlesome mother-in-law. It was the look of a predator, checking the structural integrity of a fence. A week later, the calls began. Real estate agents would pull into my driveway, looking confused, clutching printouts of my property details. They were under the impression that the house was being sold as an emergency liquidation. Each time I chased them off, I felt a deeper, more hollow ache in my chest. I asked Mark about it, and he started working late every single night. The merger he was obsessed with seemed to be taking all his time, leaving me alone in a house that was suddenly feeling like a target. The point of no return came on a Tuesday. I had returned home early from a business trip, having successfully closed a deal that would have secured my position for the next year. I walked into the house, expecting the familiar silence of an empty home, but heard voices coming from the living room. It was Elena and an attorney I didn't recognize, sitting at my dining table, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. "The title transfer will be finalized by Friday," I heard Elena say, her voice vibrating with a sharp, triumphant edge. "She's unstable. The narrative of her mental breakdown is already being corroborated by her husband's testimony. Once she's out, we sell, and we split the proceeds as discussed." The world tilted on its axis. My ears began to ring, a high-pitched, piercing hum that drowned out the rest of the room. I felt a wave of nausea, cold and acidic, rise in my throat, forcing me to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. My vision blurred at the edges of the furniture losing their sharpness, turning into jagged shapes of betrayal. I didn't storm in immediately. I retreated into the hallway, my heart hammer-striking against my sternum. I crept toward the side table where I kept the emergency safe, the one Mark thought I had forgotten the combination to. My hands were shaking so violently that the key scratched against the metal, a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the quiet house. I pried the door open. My fingers scrambled over the velvet lining, searching, until they closed around the cool, heavy edge of the original deed, wrapped in its protective plastic sleeve. I pulled it out, and as I clutched it to my chest, the reality hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just trying to sell the house, they were orchestrating a legal coup to erase me from my own life, painting me as a manic, incapacitated woman to steal everything I owned. I saw the laptop sitting on the side table, the one Mark had been using. I walked over, my movements stiff and robotic, and opened it. The screen was still logged into his email. I didn't need to look for long. There, at the top of the inbox, was a thread titled Project Exit Strategy. It was a detailed plan of how to declare me mentally incompetent, signed off by a doctor I'd only met once for a routine checkup, and fueled by a series of falsified bank records that made it look like I'd been draining our accounts to fund a secret, non-existent gambling addiction. I looked at the documents, then at the house I had spent 10 years building, and then at the reflection of my own face in the black mirror of the computer screen. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She wasn't the victim they expected. She was someone who had just discovered exactly how much she had to lose, and precisely how much she was willing to destroy to keep it. The terror evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, freezing clarity. I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to turn their own game into their funeral. I stood in the doorway of the dining room, the heavy paper of the deed tucked firmly under my arm. My legs felt like lead, but my heartbeat had slowed to a rhythmic, predatory thrum. Elena was still laughing, a brittle, high-pitched sound as she leaned over the table, tapping a fountain pen against a stack of forged transfer papers. The attorney, a man with an oily sheen to his skin and a suit that cost more than his integrity, looked up as he caught my shadow. Elena's face transformed in an instant. The triumphant smirk didn't just vanish, it curdled, twisting into a mask of indignant fury. "Sarah? You were supposed to be in the city until tomorrow evening. What are you doing skulking in the shadows like a common thief?" She stood up, smoothing her skirt with an air of practiced authority, but I saw her hand tremble. She was a woman who lived by the rule that volume and audacity could overcome any truth. "I'm not the thief here, Elena," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. I walked into the room, my footsteps clicking against the hardwood like a countdown. "Though I suppose I should thank you. You were so busy trying to frame me as a mentally unstable wreck that you forgot to check if I'd actually left my key in your reach." The attorney cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Mrs. Miller, there is no need for dramatics. We have medical documentation regarding your recent episodes of erratic behavior. Your husband has already signed off on the power of attorney." "My husband," I repeated, the word tasting like bile. I walked to the head of the table and dropped the original deed right onto the middle of their papers. The thud was solid and final. "My husband is currently in the garage, isn't he? Why don't you call him in? I'd love to hear him explain exactly how he plans to sell a property that is held in an irrevocable trust solely under my name, with no provision for his intervention." Elena's eyes darted to the deed, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray. She snatched it up, her fingers clawing at the paper as if she could erase the legal seal by sheer force of will. This is a copy. You're trying to bluff us with a forgery." "It's the original," I replied, feeling a cold smile touch my lips. "And while you've been busy forging my signature on quitclaim deeds, I've been recording this entire conversation. That little pin on my blazer? It's not just a fashion choice, Elena. It's a high-fidelity microphone." The attorney turned pale, his briefcase halfway open. He started to stammer, his earlier arrogance dissolving into a puddle of self-preservation. "Now see here, I was told there was a legitimate claim." "Save it for the state bar," I snapped, turning my gaze back to Elena. She looked small now, hunched over the table like a predatory bird that had just realized it was flying into a gale. "Mark!" Elena screamed toward the kitchen, her voice cracking. "Mark, get in here! She's acting out again! Do something!" The door swung open, and Mark entered. He looked disheveled, his shirt untucked, his eyes darting from the documents to me, and finally to the digital recorder I was holding. He didn't look like a husband, he looked like a cornered rat. He didn't rush to my side to apologize or explain. Instead, he straightened his back, trying to summon the shadow of the man I used to love. "Sarah, honey," he started, his voice dripping with false, syrupy concern. "You're clearly having a breakdown. We were only doing this for your own good. You've been so stressed, the money, the house. We thought it would be better if we took the burden off your shoulders." "The burden of my assets, you mean?" I said, stepping toward him. I stopped only inches away, smelling the stale scent of his desperation. "You weren't helping me, Mark. You were liquidating me. And the best part? I didn't just find the emails about the sale. I found the emails about the offshore account you opened in your mother's name 3 months ago." Mark's face went slack. The color drained from his skin so fast he looked like he might faint. What offshore account?" "Oh, don't play the fool," I whispered, leaning in so only he could hear. "I know about the gambling debts you've been hiding for 2 years. I know why you needed the house sold, and I know exactly who you owe that money to. But here's the twist you didn't account for. The moment you signed that first forged document, you crossed the line from a desperate husband to a criminal conspirator. And I've already sent the digital trail of your project to the district attorney." The silence in the room was absolute, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Mark looked at his mother, then back at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, frantic realization. Elena tried to speak, but her mouth worked soundlessly, like a landed fish. I had stripped them of their narrative, their leverage, and their dignity in less than 5 minutes. But this was only the beginning. I had a final, devastating card to play that would ensure they would never step foot in my life, or anyone else's, again. Mark's knees actually buckled. He reached out to grab the back of the dining chair, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, ragged hitches. "Sarah, please," he rasped, his carefully curated facade of a corporate professional finally shattering completely. "It's not what it looks like. I was backed into a corner. These people, the creditors, they weren't going to wait. Elena said if I didn't get them the liquidity, they were going to come for me, for us." Elena, sensing her grip on her son and her potential payday slipping away, finally found her voice. She stood up, her face a mask of screeching indignation. "Don't you dare blame me, Mark. You were the one who gambled away your inheritance. You were the one who begged me to find a way to get your hands on this property. Sarah, you ungrateful girl. You've been living in a house you didn't even pay the full mortgage on for the last year. I've been covering the taxes from my own savings." I let out a harsh, dry laugh that sounded foreign in the quiet room. "Is that what you told the agent? Is that the story you're going to give the police when they arrive?" I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen glowing. I didn't need to fake the call. I had already initiated it 10 minutes ago, while I was waiting for them to settle in. I kept the line open. "You see, Elena, the problem with being a professional manipulator is that you assume everyone else is as dishonest as you are. You never considered that I might actually have an auditor friend who's been tracking the household accounts since the moment I suspected something was wrong." Mark started toward me, his face twisted in a desperate, pleading grimace. "Sarah, give me the phone. Let's just talk. We can go to a hotel. We can talk this out like adults." "Stay back," I warned, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. I didn't shout, but the sheer coldness in my tone stopped him dead in his tracks. "If you take one more step toward me, I will trigger the alarm system. And this time, it's not for the police. It's for the private security firm I hired to document the physical evidence of your tampering with my legal files." "Security firm?" the attorney gasped, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray. He began shoving his documents back into his briefcase, his hands fumbling and awkward. I was misled. I had no idea there were falsified accounts involved. I'm leaving. This is no longer a matter for my firm." "You aren't going anywhere," I said, my gaze shifting to the attorney. "You signed a notarized document that you knew was based on a fraudulent premise. You're a co-conspirator in an attempted grand larceny and fraud case. My lawyer is already in the driveway with the local authorities. You really think you can just walk out that door?" The sound of sirens in the distance was the final nail in the coffin. Mark collapsed into the chair, burying his face in his hands, his bravado replaced by the whimpering of a man who realized his life was over. Elena, however, was a cornered snake. She lunged toward the table, grabbing a letter opener, her eyes wild with a sudden frantic madness. "You won't ruin me! I spent my whole life building this family, managing this estate, making sure everything was perfect. You were just a guest, a temporary tenant." She swung at me, but she was slow, fueled by panic and age. I sidestepped easily, grabbing her wrist with a force that surprised even me. I didn't hit her. I didn't need to. I simply twisted her arm behind her back, holding her firmly against the table, pressing her face down into the very documents she had spent weeks crafting. "You didn't build this family, Elena," I whispered into her ear, my voice devoid of mercy. "You destroyed it. You turned your son into a thief and a coward, and you tried to trade his integrity for a house that was never, ever going to be yours. You wanted to see me broken? Look in the mirror. You're the one who's about to lose everything." The front door kicked open. The heavy thud echoed through the house, followed by the crisp, authoritative commands of officers moving through my living room. I felt the tension in my body begin to release, the adrenaline transitioning into a cold, sustained resolve. I watched as the officers moved toward us, their flashlights cutting through the dimming afternoon light. Mark didn't even try to stand up when they approached him. He just looked at me, a look of profound, pathetic realization in his eyes. He finally understood that the person he had been trying to erase was the only thing that had been holding his world together. And now, she was the one pulling the trigger on his downfall. The aftermath was a blur of blue and red lights, reflecting against the pristine windows of my living room. Watching them be led out in handcuffs felt less like a dramatic spectacle and more like watching a long overdue cleaning process. Elena, her hair disheveled and her face blotchy with rage, didn't stop screaming until she was pushed into the back of a cruiser. Mark, however, was silent. As he was led past me, he paused, his eyes hollowed out by the weight of his own choices. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time, not as the wife he had manipulated, but as the woman he had underestimated to his own ruin. The legal proceedings that followed were systematic and brutal. Because I had spent months documenting the discrepancies in our shared accounts and had kept a private, encrypted log of every conversation since the first warning sign, the defense they tried to mount crumbled in the first hearing. My lawyer, a shark of a woman I'd hired the moment I found the offshore account details, dismantled their mental instability narrative within minutes of the opening statement. By the time the trial concluded, Elena had lost her home, her social standing in the community, and her access to the trust she had spent years trying to subvert. Mark faced felony charges for forgery and financial fraud, effectively ending his career and leaving him with nothing but the debt he had been so desperate to hide. The transformation I underwent during those months was not one of bitterness, but of absolute reclamation. I stopped waiting for the world to validate my choices or for a partner to authorize my existence. I sold the house, not because I was forced to, but because I no longer wanted to live in the echoes of their betrayal. I moved into a sun-drenched loft in the city, a place where the scent of coffee and fresh starts replaced the heavy, perfumed stagnation of my old life. 6 months later, I sat on my new balcony, watching the city skyline glow under the soft amber light of the setting sun. My life was lean, quiet, and entirely mine. The legal battle had left me with a sense of clarity I had never possessed before. I had learned that the most dangerous thing you can do for yourself is to minimize your own intuition to keep the peace. I had become the architect of my own safety, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly untouchable. I poured a glass of wine, the cool stem of the glass feeling grounding in my hand. There were no more secrets, no more hidden files, and no more predatory presences lurking in the periphery of my decisions. I looked out over the horizon, feeling the phantom weight of the past finally lift from my shoulders. The woman who had been afraid to question her husband's late-night calls was a ghost, a vestige of a life that didn't know its own worth. I leaned back, listening to the hum of the city, and allowed myself a rare, genuine smile. They had tried to sell my house, they had tried to dismantle my mind, and they had tried to erase my history. They failed because they forgot the oldest truth in the book. You can build a cage for someone else, but eventually, you'll be the one left sitting in the dark. I raised my glass to the evening air, a silent toast to the girl I used to be, and a much louder one to the woman who now owned every single inch of her own future. After all, the best revenge isn't just winning, it's thriving in the life they were too small-minded to imagine for you.